All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know, we love tackling the big questions here, and this one might be the biggest yet. We asked you to send us your sources on terraforming Mars, and wow, did you deliver. It's kind of like a mashup of serious science and like this crazy futuristic dream all rolled into one. So, is it even possible? I mean, could we actually turn Mars into a second Earth? What would we have to do to pull that off? And what could go wrong along the way? I mean, based on what you've all sent in.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a pretty massive undertaking. We're talking about completely changing an entire planet. So right off the bat, you run into some big questions, like how do we actually do it, and should we even try?
Right. I mean, everything you sent in shows that Mars right now, it's cold, dry, pretty much a frozen desert. But here's the wild part. There's all this evidence that it wasn't always that way, like ancient riverbeds, signs that it used to have a thicker atmosphere. It really makes you think, right?
Yeah, and that's really the heart of this terraforming idea,
Yeah.
taking this world that's basically barren and turning it into something green, something alive. Imagine humans just walking around on Mars, breathing the air, maybe even looking up at a slightly different colored sky. That's the vision a lot of your sources are exploring.
And it's not just sci-fi anymore. We have big names like Elon Musk, NASA, SpaceX, all putting forward ideas about how to do this. One of the most common ones, and I'm sure you've seen this, is the idea of warming Mars up, kind of like a greenhouse effect.
Right, and a lot of your sources probably talked about how Martian soil and the ice at the poles, they're thought to hold a lot of carbon dioxide, coco. So the idea is if we could release that CO, it would make the atmosphere thicker, and that would trap more heat from the sun, leading to a warmer Mars. The question is, how much Kiro do we need to release, and what else might happen to the atmosphere when we do that?
Then there's this almost mind-blowing idea of creating an artificial magnetosphere to protect the planet from all that harmful radiation from the sun. That sounds like something straight out of a movie, right?
It does. But as you probably saw in your research, Mars doesn't have a global magnetic field like Earth does. And without it, the solar wind just blasts away at the atmosphere, making it thinner and thinner. Plus, all that radiation on the surface is super dangerous for life. So some scientists are proposing that we could build a giant magnetic shield in space, maybe using superconducting magnets, strategically placed to deflect all those harmful particles. It would be an engineering feat like nothing we've ever seen before.
And then you have the proposals to melt the polar ice caps. Using everything from nuclear explosions to massive mirrors in space to focus sunlight, talk about planetary scale engineering.
Yeah, melting those ice caps would release tons of water, which is obviously essential for life. And it would also release more CO, which would help with that greenhouse warming effect. But, and I'm sure your sources mentioned this, messing with the polar ice caps could have some really unpredictable consequences. We'd have to be extremely careful and do a ton of modeling to make sure we don't trigger something we can't control.
And the time scale for all of this, it's just massive. We're not talking about decades, we're talking about centuries, maybe even thousands of years, to really terraform Mars.
That's a key point to keep in mind. This wouldn't be a quick fix. It would be a multi-generational project that would require a huge sustained effort from, well, probably the entire planet.
Okay, so let's get a little more specific. One of the scenarios that comes up a lot in the terraforming discussion, and maybe in what you sent in, is this idea of a future human colony on Mars. Say, for example, it's the year 2139, and there's this permanent colony called New Dawn, something like that. What would life be like in those early days based on what you've seen?
Well, these kinds of thought experiments, like imagining this colony, they help us kind of wrap our heads around the challenges of living on Mars. Initially, we'd probably be living in biodomes.
Right, totally. Inside those biodomes, it could be pretty Earth-like, growing crops, maybe even raising families, all powered by the Martian sun. But then you step outside the dome and it's a totally different story. Frigid temperatures, dust storms that can block out the sun for months, an atmosphere that's mostly CO. Talk about a reality check.
Yeah, and that kind of stark contrast is probably what would drive projects like, let's say, Project Genesis, this hypothetical, massive, global effort to, make Mars livable within a few centuries. A really ambitious long-term goal that I'm sure a lot of your sources talked about.
So Project Genesis kicks off, and they start with some of those big engineering feats we talked about, like putting giant mirrors in orbit to reflect more sunlight onto the surface to start warming things up.
Yep, that's a way to kind of kickstart the warming process.
Yeah.
These huge reflectors, they could focus sunlight onto specific areas, like the colder parts of Mars, to try and raise the overall temperature. You probably read about that.
And then there's the idea of triggering volcanoes, basically creating artificial eruptions to release gases into the atmosphere. Sounds kind of risky though, right?
Well, there are definitely risks involved. But the thinking is that volcanic eruptions would release all sorts of gases, like KRO and water vapor, which would help thicken the atmosphere and boost that greenhouse effect. The trick would be finding a way to trigger these eruptions in a controlled way, maybe by targeting underground magma chambers with some kind of energy beam.
And then you have this idea of using specially engineered bacteria, microbes designed to break down rocks and release oxygen into the atmosphere. That's using biology to change the planet, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's like a microscopic terraforming team. These microbes would be engineered to basically eat Martian rocks and breathe out oxygen. It would be a slow process, but over time it could help build up a breathable atmosphere on Mars.
And a lot of the hypothetical timelines suggest that eventually we'd start to see some signs of progress, maybe a hint of green in some old craters, or even the formation of a lake, something they might call lake opportunity. That would be a pretty powerful symbol, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah. Even small changes like that would be a huge boost for morale and for keeping the project going. It would be proof that we're actually making a difference, that we're bringing life back to Mars.
But it wouldn't be all smooth sailing, right? Your sources probably mentioned the preservers, this movement against terraforming Mars.
Right. They bring up some really important ethical questions that we have to think about. Basically, do we have the right to completely change another planet just to make it suitable for us?
Yeah, their main argument is that Mars, even in its current state, has its own value. It has its own unique history, its own geology. And they say we should respect that. They see terraforming as a form of cosmic colonialism, imposing our will on another world.
And they might argue, as your sources probably laid out, that Mars could teach us so much about the formation of planets and the possibility of life beyond Earth, and that if we terraform it, we might lose all that valuable scientific knowledge.
And in some of the scenarios you sent in, this opposition isn't just talk. Some groups might resort to sabotage, like maybe disabling a co-form and pumping station. That would be a huge setback, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. That kind of action would not only damage the terraforming equipment, but also really endanger any humans living on Mars. And it forces us to confront the big ethical question head on. Do the potential benefits of terraforming for humanity outweigh the potential harm to another world? It's a complex issue.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture. Are we just repeating the same mistakes we've made on Earth, this time on a planetary scale? It's a pretty deep question that I'm sure came up in a lot of the stuff you sent us.
Yeah, and as if those ethical dilemmas weren't enough, a lot of the scenarios out there also explore another challenge. Mars itself might fight back against our terraforming efforts.
Totally. Like as the permafrost starts to melt, which is something a lot of the proposals rely on, it could release something we hadn't planned for. Ancient microbes that have been dormant for millions of years.
Yeah, that's a big wild card. We don't know exactly what's lurking in that Martian permafrost. It could be harmless, or it could be something that interacts with our terraforming efforts in ways we never anticipated.
And in some of the stories, these ancient microbes don't play nice with the Earth life we've brought to Mars. They could even trigger a planetary blight that wipes out our crops and sucks up all the oxygen we've worked so hard to create.
A blight like that would be a major disaster for any Martian colonies and for the whole terraforming project. It would be a harsh reminder that we're messing with a complex alien ecosystem that we don't fully understand.
So humans would have to adapt, right? Maybe they'd develop new types of algae that can resist the blight and pump out even more oxygen, kind of like a biological arms race.
Exactly. It would be a constant process of trial and error, of learning from our mistakes and coming up with new solutions to overcome the challenges that Mars throws at us.
And along the way, we might stumble upon some unexpected resources, like maybe we discover a huge aquifer deep underground filled with liquid water. That would be a game changer, right?
Absolutely. Finding a readily available source of water on Mars would be a huge boost for any human settlements and for the terraforming project as a whole. It would open up so many possibilities.
These challenges, these discoveries, they often lead to a pretty big realization. Terraforming might not be about bending Mars to our will, but about learning to work with it, to coexist with this alien world.
Yeah, it's more about finding a balance, a way to create a habitable environment that respects the unique nature of Mars.
So let's jump way ahead in time. Say it's the year 2512, hundreds of years after the start of Project Genesis. What might Mars look like by then?
Well, by then, Mars would likely be a very different place, although still quite different from Earth. Maybe with rivers flowing, maybe even small forests. An atmosphere you could breathe, at least in the lower elevations. Maybe the pressure would be up to a fraction of what it is on Earth.
And the pictures that come to mind, it's like a world that's still harsh and unforgiving, but also teeming with life. Imagine kids born on Mars playing under a Martian sky. Pretty amazing to think about.
Yeah, it would be the birth of a truly Martian civilization, adapted to a world that we helped create. But back on Earth, the debates would probably still be raging.
Right, the big questions wouldn't go away. Should we be terraforming other planets at all? Should we focus on adapting ourselves to different environments instead? And are we just spreading our impact across the galaxy without really thinking about the consequences?
It all comes back to our responsibility as a species. As we venture out into the cosmos, do we deal with a sense of humility and caution? Or do we just repeat the same patterns of exploitation?
It's like this whole idea of terraforming Mars. It's like holding up a mirror to humanity. It shows our drive to survive, our ingenuity, but also our potential for recklessness.
It's a reminder that even as we dream big, as we reach for the stars, we have to be mindful of the impact we have on the universe around us.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of terraforming Mars, based on all the awesome sources you sent in, let's leave you with one final thought. What lessons can we learn from this grand experiment, this hypothetical journey to transform another planet? What principles should guide us as we explore and potentially settle other worlds? Because those choices will shape not only our future in space, but also our understanding of who we are as a species.